Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. In this episode, I was privileged to sit down virtually with Professor Justin Brooks, director and co-founder of the California Innocence Project. Professor Brooks founded the California Innocence Project in 1999, and under his direction, the project has exonerated dozens of innocent people, trained hundreds of law students, and changed multiple laws in California related to wrongful convictions. Since 1999, Professor Brooks has worked extensively in Latin America. He is the founder and director of Cal Western's Latin American Institute of Law and Justice, which is devoted to training law students and lawyers in Latin America and improving justice systems. Professor Brooks has published extensively on criminal justice issues and is the author of the only legal casebook devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions. Academy Award-nominated actor Greg Kinnear portrays Professor Brooks in the movie Brian Banks. Professor Brooks is also the author of a recently released book that is highly recommended. And as a side note, if you access the book on Audible, you will have the added benefit of listening to Professor Brooks as the narrator as well. The book is called You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. And Professor Brooks talks about the genesis of this book on this episode. Our conversation was wide-ranging, engaging, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I did recording it. Welcome, Justin, to the Superintendent's Hangout. And I was wondering if you could start out by telling us about yourself, about your origin story, and what brings you to this moment.
Sure. Well, I guess how far back should I go? I'm a child of immigrant parents. My dad was an Australian professional tennis player. My mom was a school teacher. They had 7 kids. They came to the United States to get better opportunities for me and my siblings. I grew up all along the East Coast. I went to high school in Puerto Rico, which I spent a lot of formative years in Latin America. I then went to college in Philadelphia. I went to law school in Washington, D.C. I went to law school to become a business lawyer. And then my first year criminal law professor took us to a prison. And that really changed the course of my career, the course of my life. I started teaching in a prison when I was in law school. And I just got into criminal law. I became a criminal defense attorney when I got out of law school. I started a prison education program. My wife and I ran a family literacy program in the DC prisons, teaching the inmates how to teach their children to read. And we would bring the kids to the prison every week and do literacy sessions with them. I became a law professor, and I eventually moved to Michigan. And when I was in Michigan, one day I read about a young woman on death row in Illinois, and the article said she was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And I thought, that can't be possible. And so I went out and met her. It's a young Puerto Rican woman. And, as I talk about in my new book, you might go to prison even though you're innocent. I still don't know to this day what compelled me to get involved in that case, but it probably was a mixture of having spent so many years in Puerto Rico and seeing this young Puerto Rican who looked a lot like the kids I went to high school with, in that situation where she was facing execution, and she told me she was innocent. And so I recruited some law students and started working her case. Eventually, her death sentence was reversed. But that experience of working with students on that case inspired me to start the California Innocence Project. I moved to California, which had the biggest prison system, I think at the time, in the world. Texas has overtaken us, and the biggest death row in the world. More than 600 people were on death row at that time. And California has 3 strikes and mandatory minimums and one of the toughest criminal legal systems in the United States. So I started the California Innocence Project 24 years ago. And since then, I've been freeing innocent people and doing it with students as part of their educational, part of their law school education. They take a year-long course with me to work on cases with me. And just last week, we freed our 40th innocent person from prison.
Wow.
So that's basically birth until last week.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that. And also I did see that the Union Tribune, I saw an ad where your organization received an award, a recognition a couple of weeks back. And I also saw that the UT has been running a series of articles about the criminal justice system reform, and wrongful convictions as well. I think some of your employees or colleagues have written some articles.
Yeah, the Union Tribune came to us and said, could we put together a series of opinion pieces, but from different perspectives of people working in the criminal legal system and our clients family members and our students, to put a series of opinion pieces looking from those different perspectives at what was wrong with the system. So I wrote the first one, which was based on my new book, which goes through the causes of wrongful conviction. So I kind of had the 30,000-foot view of, why are innocent people in prison based on my 30 years doing this stuff. And then all different people in our community wrote different opinion pieces about it.
Well, I loved the book, and I read it and listened to it because I tend to be a better auditory learner. So it's nice that you, I feel like I've met you before because I've heard your voice for whatever it was, 11 hours on the.
That's a lot of time. We spent a lot of time together already.
Yeah, we already did, and you didn't even know it. So, but it was both engaging and also frustrating, and it angered me, portions of it. And so I was wondering if you could explain to our listeners kind of the process that the California Innocence Project goes through in choosing cases, right? I'm sure there's no shortage of emails and phone messages from people who think you should take on their case or their loved one's case. How do you narrow that down and take the cases that are going to have the most impact?
Sure. So we get about 6,000 pieces of mail a year. And most of them are the same. I'm innocent, or my husband's innocent, my boyfriend's innocent, my girlfriend's innocent. And with each letter, we respond. We have a questionnaire that people fill out, giving us all the details of their case, and then we'll gather their appellate documents. Typically, a law student will call their trial lawyer, their appellate lawyer, and we have this whole information gathering period with each case. Then a memorandum is put together by a law student, kind of pulling everything together in the case. That's reviewed by a lawyer in our office who sits down with that student. If we decide that case has possibilities, it goes into the clinic process, where we have presentations twice a week on cases. I have the awful Caesar-like power of thumbs up or thumbs down on whether cases proceed. It's actually the hardest part of my job, because I see a lot of cases where I believe the person very well may be innocent. But unfortunately, by the time we get cases is when people lost their trial and lost their initial appeals. And so I can only take a case on if I believe there's a chance at developing strong evidence of innocence. So, for example, we've never won a drug case in the United States. I won one in Nicaragua where the guy had no drugs. But in the United States, there's two elements for a drug case. You have drugs, and you knew you had drugs. And, people aren't brought to trial typically if the police haven't got drugs. And then the question for the jury is whether the person knew they had drugs. Right. And I see a lot of these cases that are sad because I think maybe the person's innocent. Like, you'll get, 5 people in a car, and one kid has drugs in their backpack, and everybody in the car gets charged with possession of drugs. Well, if the jury didn't believe that that person didn't know they had drugs, then I can't do anything about that. I've never won a self-defense case because once the jury looks at it and says, we don't believe it's a valid self-defense, that's so fact-based of, what was the perception in your mind of danger and a whole lot of factors like that. So those cases, they're winnable at trial, but once you're convicted, they're not winnable anymore. So I go through a lot of cases, and based on my experience doing this for 30 years, sometimes it's super sad. I mean, we get students standing there crying when I'm saying we got to close it because they've met with the client. They might believe they're innocent. They've talked to their family members, but I know that we're not going to be able to develop that evidence because it's got to be super powerful. So we do a lot of murder cases. We do a lot of rape cases. We do a lot of cases where forensic evidence could prove innocence. But when it comes down to this sort of a story was presented to the jury and we can't make it any better, and they lost. That's the end of the road.
You mentioned forensic evidence, forensic science, and perhaps some of it needs to be science in quotation marks, certainly from recollections from reading your book. Could you talk to us about kind of the range of approaches that have historically been used in the U.S. to convict and sometimes wrongfully convict people? Things like tooth bite analysis and fire science, and all the way to DNA, which I think you present in your book as kind of the gold standard, right? So why do we have this range of sciences that, I mean, may I go out on a limb and call some of them, they sound kind of like junk science, and you're playing with people's lives. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So my book breaks down the first title of my book was Top 10 Reasons You Might Go to Prison, Even Though You're Innocent. And then my publisher said, oh, that's too clickbaity. And I thought, isn't clickbaity good? But they didn't agree. I guess it's an academic publisher. So I wanted to be in very common language, the book, which I hope I succeeded at, of people to understand these principles that are often in very lofty, legalistic, and medical terms. So one of the chapters is you were convicted by a jury that was blinded by quote unquote science, because there's all kinds of levels of quality of science. But often what I see is people getting convicted because they had a really good witness. So they got up on the stand and they talked about all their doctorates and how smart a person they are, and they blew the jury away that they went to Harvard and this and that. But that didn't change the fact that the so-called science they're testifying to is a junk science, or one that should be a lot of grain of salt should be presented with. So yeah, DNA is the gold standard of forensic testing, because when done correctly, you can narrow it down to 1 in billions, 1 in quadrillions chances that it's inaccurate. Again, there's a human element in it. So it's only as good as whoever gathers the evidence, tests the evidence, reads the result. There also can always be contamination in those processes. But when done really well, the science itself is the best of all sciences. And then we have these pseudosciences that aren't sciences really at all, like bite mark evidence, where you have basically bored dentists with too much time on their hands who watch too much CSI coming in and saying, this bite mark matches this guy's dentition. And a bite mark isn't even a bite mark. It's bruising that results from the trauma of being bitten. They're extremely vague. They're very hard to read. And we've seen a lot of people go to prison and then later on find out they're innocent, where there was testimony from these so-called forensic odontologists. We've seen the same thing in arson science, where there is a science of arson, and there are some experts, some of the best are here in California, but even those experts have changed their minds on how you can figure out whether fire is intentionally started or accidentally started. And I'll give you an example that for many years, whenever after the fire, they would see what looked like 3 points of ignition. So you'd go into the house that was burned down and you'd see the black spot right where they believed, okay, the fire started here. Whenever they would see more than one of those spots, they'd say, oh, this must have been intentional because it started in 4 spots. So an accidental fire doesn't start in 4 spots. But now we know that fire, when it starts getting into a rage and getting really hot, it can go up to your ceiling and then drop in other locations. So it doesn't spread evenly, it can just drop. And later on, when they look at it, it looks like there were all these different points of ignition, but there was really just one. So it might start because of an electrical problem next to the socket, but then you see what looks like it's starting on the other side of the room. And there's been many people who've gone to prison because of that testimony. So there's problems with almost every forensic science as I go through them in my book, because even DNA, you can have a situation, for example, where a woman says she's raped. She calls the police. Police officer comes to her house. It's a small town in California. It's out in these rural areas where I work. Then she says, this is the guy who raped me. The police say, okay, give me your clothes from that you were wearing so we can get them tested. Officer then throws the clothes in the back seat of the car. Now he goes over to the house to pick up the suspect, puts him in the back seat of the car. Now he sneezes or coughs, and his DNA shows up on her clothing. At trial, he's saying, I've never seen this woman in my life. And you'll have a DNA expert come in and say, that's interesting because his DNA is all over her clothing. And the defense attorney probably won't have any way of unpacking that and even knowing that the way that contamination occurred. So even with DNA, you can have those kinds of things happen. And then it's, just rampant with these junkier sciences.
It was a curious side note, but I think his name was Dr. Sperber, the dentist. You mentioned him in the book. I'm not trying to out people, but strangely enough, he was my dentist when I first came to San Diego. And no joke. And I remember going to his office, and he had these magazines that featured the work that he had done. He did, anytime there was a natural disaster, they would call this guy in to help identify remains. And so when you mentioned him in the book, I looked him back up. I go, oh my God, it's the same dude. He's no longer with us, but he seemed like a nice guy. But it's just interesting because a very distinguished guy, and you think he's got 12 degrees on his wall.
Get him.
Yeah,
I'm surprised you can get in to see him. I mean, Skip Sperber was known. A lot of people thought he was the best dentist in the world.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. So it's
the science itself. And actually, he's such a perfect example. Skip, great guy, super nice guy. I really loved Skip. He came in and helped us exonerate our client. And he was big enough man to come and admit that he was wrong, that his testimony should have never been admitted. But here's a guy whose resume is unbelievable. That he's identifying bodies at World Trade Center on 9/11. He's testifying in the Ted Bundy trial. He's in all these massive cases. He was a dentist in the Navy for 45 years. He was the international president of the Forensic Odontology Association. So he has this resume that's 10 miles long. And so he gets up on the stand and everyone's like, okay, if this dude thinks, I'm going along with whatever this guy says, like he knows better than me. And that's the problem.
It's that concept of false proxy, right? Sometimes a long list of degrees is a false proxy for the truth in some ways, right? It's interesting. You mentioned working in small towns, and that was something that struck me in your book as well, where you talk about the fact that prosecutors and police and there's fewer resources in small towns, and perhaps the social pressures of a small community where everyone knows each other and people are defending their reputation maybe in a different way, that it's even perhaps worse to be falsely accused of a crime in a small town. I'm not trying to cast aspersions towards small town America, but could you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Well, I'll cast aspersions.
Okay.
I mean, I was new to California 25 years ago. And so I've spent my whole life in big cities. I was born in New York. I went to school in Philadelphia. I went to school in Washington, D.C. I was high school in San Juan. I've never spent much time at all in rural areas. And when I came to California, I realized it gets weirder the further you get from the water. I mean, it's just those small towns, some of them from the criminal legal system, they're 100 years old. And first, there's the attitude of, if you're in a big city, a murder case is not that big a deal. Like, practicing in LA, there's so many murder cases that it's not like they cling to this one murder case as like the most important case in history, unless it's the O.J. Simpson case. So, but in these small towns, when I roll in there and say, you guys might have got this wrong, that was their biggest case of their career. And so, first of all, the attitude towards working with me on these cases has always been terrible. In the Bill Richards case out in San Bernardino, they wouldn't give us access to the evidence room. They wouldn't even tell us if there was evidence. I had to litigate whether DNA was a valid science. Oh. It was 15 years of litigation, and they appealed every decision. And so, first of all, I think people are more likely to be wrongfully convicted in those small towns because the police don't have often the training or machinery to process homicide scenes. It's not what you see on television. CSI doesn't show up. It'll be some guy rolling in who's used to dealing with DUIs and simple assaults. And the next thing you know, they're in the middle of a brutal homicide scene. And in Bill Richards' case, the entire crime scene was contaminated. There was no time of death analysis done. There were all these things the police could have done that would have shown he was innocent on the night of the crime. and he ends up in prison for all these years as a result of that. So, and also exactly what you just talked about, I also went and researched the phenomenon of the kind of round up the usual suspects that happens in small towns. There's kind of the local ne'er-do-well that everybody, thinks they're the troublemakers. And you see that in, for instance, the West Memphis 3 case, where these kids were into heavy metal music and wearing black and dyeing their hair black. And so when this horrible murder happens, they're the first suspects and they get wrongfully convicted. And I went out and found a whole bunch of wrongful convictions in rural areas that had happened in a city. Nobody would have looked at those people. Now, on the flip side, we see a lot of wrongful convictions in the city due to over-policing. So it's kind of two sides of the coin. There's under-policing that happens in the rural areas where they don't have the equipment and resources to handle the cases. And then in the inner city, we see people getting caught up in these dragnets, like a group of kids.
Like stop and frisk kind of things, or?
Yeah, like let's say a group of kids are selling drugs. 3 kids are selling drugs on a street corner in LA. One kid is on the football team with another kid. He stops to talk to him. The police roll up. They're all getting arrested. And since they don't have to literally have the drugs on their person to be charged with them, they're going to end up getting convicted of that, all 4 of them. Because how is that one kid going to prove, like, I wasn't selling drugs? And someone will say they were all together and they were selling drugs. So you do see that happening. And those cases are heartbreaking. I look at a lot of them and I think, yeah, this kid might be innocent. It certainly has provided lessons to me in parenting my own children that, situational stuff can get you convicted in this state. And so you do have to be careful who you hang out with, where you hang out, because you significantly increase your chances of being wrongfully convicted.
Well, that's, bringing this back to the school community that I serve. I think that's a message for students, but also for staff. And then I think about one of the chilling parts of your book talks about people who work as au pairs, summer nanny kind of help. And I'm thinking that had never occurred to me that was even a risky area. But as soon as I read that part, I called my daughter, who's a college sophomore, and I go, you can do any damn job you want, but don't tell me that your summer job is going to be a nanny somewhere, because I will pay you to not do that job. Can you talk a little bit about that idea?
Yeah, so baby death cases are the saddest cases I get. They are the hardest cases to litigate. They cost the most money because I always need a bunch of experts to try to figure out even what happened. But we now know that, for instance, there's this triad of symptoms that whenever doctors see them in babies, they assume it's an abuse case. And it's subdural hematomas and retinal hemorrhaging. It's basically a swelling brain, blood on the brain, and a swelling of your retina. And this can happen because of about 20 different causes. Yet for decades, doctors have been diagnosing, if that happens, it's abuse. And you see these horrible cases where babies are born, and during the birth process, due to the pressure of it, they can actually have those symptoms, but nobody notices them because it's subdural, it's beneath the skin, it's bruising that you don't see, it's swelling that you don't see. And if the baby has good color, is breathing okay, you're going to be kicked out of the hospital within 24 hours due to the insurance company. They go home, and now whoever's caring for this child, let's say the baby rolls off the changing table, or a million different ways babies can be injured. They now go back to the hospital. Baby dies. Now they're going to do a CT scan. They're going to do an X-ray. They're going to find those injuries from birth, but they're not going to have been documented at birth. And they're going to say that's an abuse case. Almost always the child care provider says something incriminating, because when you bring a baby to the hospital and they were in your control, you feel guilty. You feel responsible. So they'll write on the report, parent or child care provider says they're guilty, says they're responsible. These are can you imagine, first you lose your child, then people around you start thinking you killed your child. You start getting interrogated for it while you're going through this grief. You then go on trial. You probably lose your job in that process. You spend every penny you ever had to defend yourself. And now you go to prison as a baby killer, which is the absolute lowest of the low in a prison.
Right.
So you're probably going to have to be locked in solitary confinement for your own protection, which I had a client almost 20 years in that situation. And it's tragic. And there's many of those cases out there. I've had 4 separate cases like that where I've been able to free my clients. But man, they are hard cases and they take years and years of litigation.
Well, and I'd imagine there's no political will to go back and re-examine those types of cases, right? I mean, you're talking about newborns and toddlers, right? I mean, nobody's going to go, I'm making it a crusade to make sure that wrongful convictions related to these kids' deaths or something that we're going to examine. I mean, I can imagine the courage that it takes from even, I think you talk about Bonnie Dumanis here in San Diego, and I can't recall if it was a case related to the death of a child, but how she pretty courageously went back in, waded through the political fray and was like, wait a second, we got to have a department, a unit that goes back and looks at these wrongful convictions. That's courage right there.
Yeah, she did. And in fact, the first case that she exonerated that we did together was a baby death case. Ken Marsh, who spent 20 years in prison, and he and his girlfriend, it was his girlfriend's baby, had said for 20 years this baby fell off the couch, but the baby had a lot of excessive bruising, and the reason was the baby had an undiagnosed blood disorder. And Bonnie worked together with our project and a couple of other lawyers who had the case, and we got 3 neutral experts to evaluate the evidence, and she joined us in a motion to free him, which was great. I mean, San Diego is a fairly conservative town, and that was 20 years ago when it was even more conservative. And she did the right thing. And it's hard sometimes to do the right thing in a political climate.
You mentioned CSI and the pop culture fascination with those types of shows, and whether it's accurate or not, it sounds like it's mostly not accurate. Do you feel like those types of shows and movies are kind of skewing society's view towards the difference between real forensic science and the junk science? Because, you go, God, we're the richest country, the biggest state and the wealthiest country. You'd think we'd be able to go back and take make some of these sciences that are not really sciences to disallow them essentially in a courtroom, but that hasn't happened. Is some of that because we're fascinated with this and we think that if someone in a white lab coat says it's the case, it is, or what's behind that?
Yeah, I think we sort things through the process. I mean, you can get scientific evidence discounted if you can show it's more prejudicial than probative and it's totally unreliable. But typically judges just say, oh, we'll let it go to the weight of the evidence. Like, let the jury assess how much stock to put into it. And that's created a problem. I think the other problem, there's a really fundamental problem I talk about in my book, because I work all around the world. I spend a lot of time in Latin America, a lot of time in Europe. One of the things I'm acutely aware of that makes our system unique, that I think most Americans don't think about, is because we have 50-some penal codes and 50-some different jurisdictions in the United States, all the states and then all the territories, the District of Columbia, all have their own criminal legal system. And then those criminal legal systems really operate at the county level, not even at the state level. So really within California, we have like 100 criminal legal systems, because prosecutors have prosecutorial discretion to prosecute whatever cases they decide should be prosecuted. And they really set the agenda within their own county of what's going to happen. So unlike places like Britain, where they created a national commission to review baby death cases, and that national commission had the power to let those parents out of prison and those childcare providers out of prison, we don't have that capacity in the US. We don't have any national criminal justice policies. It's all by the state and local level. So we have to grind these cases out, county after county, court after court. And that's why it's so slow in making changes. Like, for 20-some years, I've been arguing about bad identification procedures in California, and we fought county by county to get them to change how they were doing lineups, how they were doing photo arrays, how the police were doing these processes. And finally, we got the legislature to force every county to change the way they're doing it, but just last year. And now finally, Los Angeles has to change. And so we had the largest county in the United States that was refusing to follow the science on identifications just because the DA decided. And that's a real downside. I see, there's upside in letting California be California and Texas be Texas and California be California. And that's the principle of federalism, is that if states have an identity, it'll keep the union together. And I get that. But there's some big downsides to that structure. We see that with gun control, for example, that we don't have any national gun control laws. So really, what's the point in the fact of DC having the strictest gun laws in the United States if you can buy a gun in a Walmart by just crossing the bridge? You don't get that kind of control over our system, and it's just dramatically different as you go state to state and county to county.
Yeah, I think most people, myself included, don't think of it that way, right? We just think there's kind of a much more unified system. You mentioned Latin America. I lived in Guatemala, and I traveled extensively still in Latin America. And I'm just wondering if you could talk to us about some of your work. You touch on it a little bit in the book. It's got to be really presenting some unique challenges, right? In terms of on the level of police corruption in a lot of cases, and political forces at work. How do you even begin the work of, I'm assuming it's Innocence Project related, but in foreign countries? How did you even get into that?
Well, I got into working in Latin America when my parents dropped me in a Puerto Rican high school in 1979, 1980.
Not by choice, right?
No. So my first job in Latin America was at, the second McDonald's in Puerto Rico. So I've been working in Latin America my whole life. I'm really powerfully connected to it. We live here on the border.
Yeah.
And that's meaningful to me. I know it isn't for a lot of people, sadly, in San Diego who don't cross that border, but I'm over there all the time. In fact, I just got back from Mexico City, where I was trapped for 3 days due to the volcano.
Oh, that's right.
Popo in Puebla.
Yeah.
How long ago? Almost 30 years ago, I trained the first 12 public defenders in Chile after the fall of Pinochet. And Chile had, a horrendous system where it was a totalitarian regime, where there were death camps, where police were showing up at your house at night and executing your husband, and just terrible. And I think the pendulum swung dramatically as a result after Pinochet, where Chile ended up having a single mom president, things like that we haven't seen in this country. I think the pendulum has never swung that dramatically in one direction in this country. We've never had hyperinflation. We haven't had a war on our territory, really. I mean, the bombing of Pearl Harbor is a long time ago and thousands of miles away from the mainland. So we haven't experienced what you and I know, if you've spent a lot of time in Latin America, that Latin America has experienced, this dramatic, Argentina having 10 presidents in 1 year, and, just totally currency devalued 95% in 12 months, things like that don't happen here. So you don't see that pendulum swinging. So Chile is a real success story in Latin America, where they slowly changed their justice system, starting in the South and working their way to Santiago and building courthouses and training people how to do trials. And they started having a lot of transparency and trials going on. For the past 8 years, I've been doing that work in Mexico. Now, Mexico is another story. First of all, the size of it is just, people don't realize the size of it who don't spend it there.
Yep.
Massive. Mexico City is a country.
Yep.
It's not a city. United States has 200 law schools. Mexico has more than 2,000 law schools. So they're churning out law students that haven't been trained on how to do trials. And Mexico just started doing trials 8 years ago. 400 years, no trials. There's a great documentary about this called Presunto Culpable. Watch where they record a wrongful conviction as it's happening through the process in Mexico, because you had no trials. Everything was filed on paper. The police report was deemed valid. There was no way to challenge it. It was just like, the police report's correct. So in a country that has the second most corrupt police force in the world, second only to Egypt, The police were never questioned. And so, I mean, and now as I'm saying this to you, I'm even feeling overwhelmed by it. So, and on top of that, you got a drug war going on.
Yeah.
You got, an economy that's not good. You got horrendous politics that actually make even the Trumpian age in the US look, normal. And so, how do I do that? I just, this is the same advice I give to my students and my lawyers. I look at what I can do today. What can I do for this one person in front of me? What can I do for this one university? And so I've launched 35 innocence organizations in Latin America, from Chile to Argentina, to Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Central America, and I've got about 7 now in Mexico. And, we're freeing innocent people. We just had a big win in Tabasco, which was documented by Netflix. A Netflix series was actually done about it, called Duro Razonable. And, I have a lot of faith in young people, which I guess is a good message for this podcast. Mm-hmm. I'm also, among my many titles, is I'm director of Mexico's National Moot Court Program. So I put on moot court competitions between students all around the country. And I was just this week in Mexico City doing that. And these young people really want a new system. They want it to work. The new system is good on paper, but the only way to make it real is that people are trained to know how to operate it. And then I think that's the best way to bring stability to the country. If there's no rule of law, there's no stability, there's no economic security. And, when you look at the United States since World War II, there's a reason the dollar has been the most powerful currency around the world since then. It's because people have confidence in the US legal system that when you invest in the United States, you can sue somebody if they screw you over. If somebody tries to take your building, you can sue them and get it back. And that importance of the rule of law is what's been lacking for so long in Latin America. And then people don't have confidence, and then they don't invest, and then you see currencies collapsing. So it's much bigger even than my wrongful conviction work. It's just sort of, that's the tip of the iceberg of a bigger issue of, like, you need to have stable justice systems, you need to have stable legal systems in order to have good economy, people feeling safe where they live, and all the things that we really take for granted here.
Yeah, I like your message of just focus on the case right in front of you, the person right in front of you that day, because when you start to think about all the way down the line to police practices, right, and the training of police officers who in Tijuana might earn $500 a month, in an expensive border city, and so it's like there's not much incentive in there to not start going to the wrong side of the law just to feed your kids.
Yeah.
That rolls all the way through.
I was asked the last presidential election in Mexico, a friend of mine who's a big donor in Mexico was actually meeting with the different candidates. And he says to me, give me one policy that I can pitch that's very simple. And I said, here it is. Fire half the police in Mexico and double the salaries of the other half. It won't increase your budget, and you're better off having half the police that have a reason to hold on to their jobs than all these police that can get more money working at McDonald's, because you're always going to have corruption if you don't pay people well, whether you're talking about police or whether you're talking about school teachers.
That's right.
Whether you're talking about secretaries, whether they're going to bring home staplers every afternoon and start selling them on eBay. I mean, it just creates corruption when people are underpaid.
I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the 700-mile march. Maybe it's not called a march, a walk that you went on, a journey to Sacramento I think it was to try to get cases overturned, mm-hmm. and kind of what led to that, and then what kept you going, and what was the end result of that. And I know it was a mixed result, but it stuck in my head from your book.
Yeah, well, it was kind of a stupid idea, crazy idea I had, which was, we were, you get to the end of the road on these cases and you've taken it all the way through the state and federal courts. Your only option left is clemency. And that's a safety valve built into every state constitution and the federal constitution, that the governor of every state has the power to release anyone they want from prison. Mm. And the president of the United States has the power to release anyone the president wants from federal prison. And at the end of every presidential term, they all turn their dirty little list in. And when the news isn't paying attention on the last day, it'll usually be a bunch of people connected to big law firms. It'll be Wall Street people. It won't be the common Joe usually who can't get on that list. And so that's always frustrated me, is like it's so politicized. So my office filed 12 clemency petitions on behalf of 12 different Californians, very diverse cases, diverse people, Black, white, Latino, Asian, young, old, men, women, all different kinds of cases. But in every case, there was strong evidence of innocence, and we were not being successful in courts. And so then I thought, but how the hell am I going to get the governor's attention to these clemency petitions? Because everybody files them. And so I came up with this crazy, stupid idea that I would walk the petitions from San Diego to Sacramento, and that would get the attention because the news would be, why is this crazy law professor walking across the state? And then I told my staff about it, kind of half hoping they'd talk me out of it. Instead, they said, oh, that's a great idea, boss. You should definitely do that. And then 2 of them volunteered to walk with me. And so we left San Diego. This is 10 years ago. And started walking up the coast. At first, we thought it'd be 500 miles. It ended up being 712 miles because that's the only way you can semi-safely do it. There's really no safe way to do it. We're on railroad tracks and highways. It took 50 days to do it, and it worked. We got the attention of the media. We had a massive press conference in Los Angeles when we got there. But it didn't work with Governor Brown, who I was originally in front of. I mean, he gave us one. He reduced one of our clients' sentence, making them parolable. So we got one person out under Governor Brown. We kept litigating the cases. We then won 4 more in court and got them out. And then Gavin Newsom has given us clemency on 4 cases. So we now have 10 of the 12 have now been freed. So it worked. It was brutal. It was, in some ways, it was the best experience of my life. In some ways, it was the worst experience of my life. Anyone who wants to look it up can go on YouTube and type in Innocence March, mile 450, and you'll see me losing my mind in Big Sur.
This is a strange question, but did you camp out along the way? Like, you're not always finding hotels, right? You're out in the boonies.
No, I was camping out most of the way. And it was the thing is, though, I fell in love with long distance walking. It's so meditative. And so the next year I walked across Spain. And so I did the Camino Santiago Compostela, which is a totally different experience because it's beautiful and there's little hotels and there's vineyards. And it was a 500-mile walk. And when I'm walking and I'm talking to people and they're all nervous whether they can do it. And I'm like, this is easy. Let me tell you, try to do 712 miles across California when there's no services for that. And it's just not, the Camino is set up for that because people have been doing it 1,000 years. So I've actually done that twice in Spain. And then I did Portugal last year.
Wow.
It's become kind of a regular thing for me to escape and walk.
It's good. Yeah, there's got to be a meditative component to it. Definitely. Once you get past the blisters.
You know what, too? I've never had a single blister.
Really?
And everyone I walk with, the young lawyers I walked across the state with, every night they were covered in blisters. I don't know, it's because I walked barefoot in the 70s or what it is, but I don't get blisters. I'm very lucky.
I was wondering if you could share, and I want to be cognizant of the time. And again, thank you for your generosity today. I was wondering if you could share some recommendations or suggestions for what folks in my profession can do with the young people today. And I know you're a parent as well. What should be happening in our public schools to perhaps head off some of ideally in the future, you're not needed, right? Mm-hmm. In a perfect world, the California Innocence Project shouldn't exist anymore. Yeah. Right. And so how do we get there?
Yeah, well, I'm very cognizant about education. My son's a high school teacher at High Tech High.
Another charter school. Yeah, that's awesome.
My daughter-in-law's at Proust. I was just over there actually last night for their big display. She does 7th and 8th grade up there. And education to me is the answer to everything. I mean, I just don't see how people don't get that the better educated our society is, the more all our problems go away. We don't have an educated enough populace in basically anything at this point. For politics, people are grossly uninformed and end up voting for things they don't even understand. Politicians take advantage of it with 3-word slogans like build a wall or lock them up, and I think the more people are educated, the more they ask questions, the better they are as citizens. And that was a big part of writing this book is, I wanted to have people read it and then become better voters, so they didn't just let politicians get away with spewing nonsense and then electing them when they weren't really reforming the system. And that's why we have now the largest prison system in the world, and we lock up the highest percentage of our population in the world, which is crazy for the richest country in the world to lock up more of its population than any other country. But that's how we got down that road, is people being uninformed and easily manipulated. So I want people who read this book to become better jurors and better voters. In terms of younger education, I mean, first of all, we have to deal with preschool education, because you learn most of what you learn in life before you even show up at kindergarten. And when I used to run this family literacy program in the prisons, we were dealing with a lot of kids who just sat in front of TV sets and no one read to them or even talked to them that much. And they were not developing at a pace where they'd be able to catch up very easily when they went to school, even if they went to the greatest school in the world, because they were falling so far behind. And then in the elementary school and junior high school and high school curriculums, we need to have kids become better informed as citizens. I mean, one of the things that is sort of a joke, but I think back to when I was a kid, and I don't know if they still do this or if you did it, but I remember in gym class, us all standing around with a parachute, just kind of lifting it up and down. And I was thinking, instead of playing with parachutes, if they just taught me how to stretch better, we might save $1 trillion on back injuries in your 50s and 60s, because no one in my generation knows how to stretch. Right, you just go out running you stretch for 2 seconds, you go running. So there's so many things that I think could be taught at school when you have this captive audience that are like life skills that are going to be utilized. That's why I like charter schools. I love high tech high. I love project-based learning. We need to, I think, rethink education in ways that'll connect with everyone. And then I think things like this book and people understanding, like we talked about earlier, that you can lessen your chances of getting in trouble in life by how you approach a situation. Yes, statistically, anyone could be wrongfully convicted, but based on where you live, who you hang out with, what activities you're involved in, all these things significantly increase your chances of ending up in a bad situation. And like there's this very sad California case where these kids have reached out to me a number of times, where they all were hanging out at a house after school. They were all smoking weed. 2 kids started wrestling. This one kid felt pinned down, so he pulled a pocket knife out and stabbed the other kid. All the kids who were there got convicted of murder under a theory that they were involved in a felony at the time, and they were all accessories. And it's a tragic case where kids being in a bad situation and ends up in tragedy. So I'm a huge believer that we need to do a lot of reform in our education system, because it's our only real way out to every problem that we face as a society. I mean, if people really understood, global warming, then I think we'd have very different policies going on. I think, but there's not that level of understanding. There's still people talking about the earth being flat and that we never landed on the moon. And I think we've seen, for instance, during COVID, how dangerous being anti-science is. I think we kind of laughed about it 4 or 5 years ago at people who are like, science is all made up. And then we get into a period of time where people don't believe in vaccines. And now polio is showing up in water supplies. Education is the only path out of that craziness.
Where do you get your inspiration, and how do you handle what must be a significant emotional toll? You've been, working in this field for so long, and as you say, it's heartbreaking and on all these different levels. Where do you get your inspiration to keep going every day, and how do you handle just the weight of the work? You probably have more losses than wins. It's the nature of the job.
Yeah, I for sure have more losses than wins. You see all the wins on TV and the lawyers holding their hands up. I mean, I'm really lucky that I have an amazing team of young lawyers. I have new students every year that are enthused and they pump me up. But when we lose in our office, everybody's crying, and then everybody slowly goes home, and then the next day we just pick it up again. It's not easy work. I mean, I tell law students, if you want a life like this, like a flat life where you go to work 9 to 5, you come home to your family, like, don't do this. If you want to have a life with incredible highs that also has a lot of lows, then this is good work. Because I've had, been able to bring 40 people home to their families and give them their lives back. And I've been involved in a lot of laws changing in California that have changed lives. I've been able to train now thousands of law students and lawyers. So what gets me through it is how I believe it's been a meaningful life and a meaningful career. But I don't know if I figured out how to do this. I did, and the emotional toll. I mean, just talking about it's actually getting me emotional. There are some days where I just can't hear another story because it's just been too many, just too much trauma. And so, yeah, I don't know if I have it fully figured out. But I'm lucky. I've got a great family. I've got, San Diego is a great place to live. I live in Ocean Beach. As soon as I go over the hill coming into Ocean Beach, I feel like, okay. And yeah, so I've got a little cottage in northern England in the middle of nowhere that I go hide in every once in a while. That helps. A little 240-year-old stone cottage in the middle of a national park.
And that's where you wrote this book, right? Or at least one draft of it.
Yeah. You got to do that stuff, that self-care. You got to know when you've hit your limit on it. And I think every teacher too, I mean, working in high schools, working with kids, they all come from different circumstances. And it's last night going to Bruce and seeing it's incredibly diverse school, and kids have been refugees that go to that school. And I was there for all their presentations on their projects that they've done. And it's just, I don't know, it's so heartwarming and sometimes so heartbreaking how much kids have to overcome to then, get their lives together and go to school and be kids. So I think, your profession too has the same thing. There's these jobs can be very psychologically taxing and physically taxing at the same time. And you need to recognize that and do the self-care you need to keep going.
I can tell you that, your book was a real inspiration to me. I remember I read it, and then, as I said, I listened to it, and I told my assistant, I'm like, it's going to be a long shot, but I read an article. This guy lives in San Diego in OB. And so maybe we'll get a little bit of the local connection and he'll be willing to come on. So I really want to thank you for your time today and your generosity and just sharing these stories with us and with our community. How can people learn more about your organization? And I'm assuming, I'm not assuming, I know there's also a mechanism to donate. You're a nonprofit. And so that's, supported by the generosity of folks as well. How can we learn more about the work?
Sure. Well, there's 2 websites to go to. One is CaliforniaInnocenceProject.org, but I also put together a website called YouMightGoToPrison.com that I think you'd like, particularly if you've read the book and I've listened to the audio, because I put on it a lot of videos of the clients being released that are stories in the book. There's also a link in there to donate, but there's a lot of supplemental material. So it's called YouMightGoToPrison.com.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Brooks, for your time today and for your work that I know there's a lot of toiling that happens outside of the bright lights of the media. And so you've taken a big detour in life from being wanting to be a corporate lawyer, but I think society is definitely better off for it. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Have a
Take
great
care.
Day. Take care.
Bye.
This episode is brought to you by E&E Financial Services through a generous donation to the Eric C. Mitchell Scholarship Fund. Are you tired of financial advisors who are more interested in pushing their products than understanding your unique financial needs? Then it's time to talk to E&E Financial Services. Founded by industry veteran Eric Sams, E&E prioritizes educating and empowering clients to make informed financial decisions they can truly understand and feel confident in. E&E believes in guiding you through the process of achieving your financial goals while providing unbiased, independent advice. Whether you need help with financial planning, portfolio management, or estate planning, E&E has got you covered. Let E&E guide your path to financial success. Visit them online at e&efinancial.com or by calling 619-487-9638. This announcement is intended for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. The content of this advertisement does not consider your individual investment objectives, financial situation, or needs. It should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional financial advice. Investment advisory services offered through Access Wealth Management, LLC. Securities offered through Exton Financial, LLC. Member FINRA, SIPC, MSRB. E&E Financial Services, Inc., Exton Financial, LLC, nor Access Wealth Management, LLC are affiliated. Thank you for listening to the Superintendent's Hangout. You can follow me on Twitter at DVS1970. Please be sure to share this show with friends and family on social media and in the real world. Thank you to Brad Bacayal for editing and production assistance, and to Tina Royster for scheduling and logistics. Thanks for hanging out, and have a great day.